Okay, so our next topic to talk about today in this interview series with the CAA with Callum Holland here is actually FPV. Now, this is going to be an interesting conversation because although I suppose we both know the regulation quite well, I'm fairly green on the FPV side of things. I fly the DJI FPVs, and I know from previous conversations on air that you've flown, but you're not necessarily a regular FPV flyer. By any means. So it's going to be an interesting conversation from that point of view. So I'm very pleased to say that Carl Payne, aka KPV, who is an experienced FPV racer, flyer and builder, who's also one of the FPV mods on the Geeksvana Discord server, has helped me out with a few of the questions actually. So thank you for that, Carl. I think that's going to help us a little bit in terms of steering the conversation towards more of what that community will want to hear. But it's also, FPV is something which is also perhaps sometimes forgotten in these conversations, mainly because it's something that I don't do. So I'm always thinking camera drones, I'm thinking future flight, that type of thing. So it isn't something that actually necessarily comes up an awful lot for me. So I'm pleased that we've got this focus on this today. Have I summarised your FPV experience correctly?
Yeah, I think you have. I tried it once. It's a really good few years ago now. It's with that. I remember I bought some new Fat Shark goggles for it. I don't know if those ones are still around. We're probably going back 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, they are actually, but yeah.
Within a couple of minutes, I felt travel sick. I get travel sick anyway. Travel sick straight away, put it back, tried a couple of times, I spent some money on it, felt sick immediately afterwards, and haven't been able to get into it since. I take my hat off to those that can FPV. I don't know how you do it. You should be fighter pilots. Because
the skill is just phenomenal, frankly, and I think it is also one of the areas of one of the niches of drone use that I feel like has a more awkward relationship with the regulations than most. I always say it's tough to convince a community to adopt and to follow regulation when they essentially breach regulation as soon as they start flying, i.e. we in a purely practical sense, we're all aware that most FPV flights probably happen without spotters. We're not saying that it automatically makes it dangerous or anything, but of course there are regulations in place that say that you must have one. So I always think it's difficult from that point of view that we're then in a situation where we're trying to bring along that side of the community, who, of course, I feel in the vast majority are actually pretty safe flyers because they have to build these things and they've got a lot of investment in there, etc. They have to learn to fly these things in I'm going to call it acro mode. There you go. I almost called it ATI mode. Then I would have been crucified in full acro. And there's a lot of skill that goes into that. So it's one of those awkward situations where no one's saying they're unsafe automatically, but of course it is against regulation, and it's one of those things where the first step happens there. So it is somewhat awkward. But and we will come back to spotters as a question because I know that's obviously a fairly chunky topic in this one. The first one I wanted to raise was actually around one of the things we see a lot online is the classification of drones, and the classification of drones in terms of toy to actually between being a toy and actually being a drone, an aircraft essentially. And I think this is more prevalent in the FPV side of things because you have tiny boops, so you have tiny little 100 grams, sometimes under that, toy drones, which do have a little video on them going to some toy goggles. I have a couple of sets of them myself, mainly for flying indoors, but where is the line in terms of because of course I would assume I could fly a toy drone outside with goggles without a spotter, but where is the line, and am I correct in even saying that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've seen this lots online in forums. First of all, I'm going to roll back to just to sort of assure the community that feedback is being listened to. I spent my own money on this new lighting rig, so we don't need any more comments of overexposed Callum and all of that. Unfortunately, I couldn't fix the whole of it, so I'm still bald. I'm sorry. But hopefully I fixed the lighting. Back onto the call. So I had some involvement with this earlier in the year when we were looking at some amendments to the regulation. A toy is, believe it or not, actually pretty well defined broadly, sort of outside of aviation regulation. And it's any product designed or intended for use in play by children under 14. Yes, I'm sad that I know that off the top of my head. But that's kind of the broadly agreed definition of toy in the UK. So any product designed or intended for use in play by children under 14. And that's kind of the bottom line on that one.
Okay, so if I wanted to put some interpretation into that, then, and I realise that's always the ground where the courts have to decide and that type of thing, and appeal and et cetera, but in terms of if I wanted to fly a whoop, which is, you know, again, a toy whoop, in my opinion anyway, sorry, I shouldn't call it a toy whoop because then I'm already classifying it as something. Which is why this conversation is a difficult one. If I'm flying a whoop and I have the goggles, and it is one of those kits that's clearly one of the beginner kits, which is aimed at beginners, obviously that I would argue that kit is also aimed towards children to be able to fly it as well. So does that automatically, or do I have to find a sticker on the box somewhere or something, or should it have, from the CAA's point of view, when we bring that definition across into aviation? Do I need this item is intended for under 14 sticker on the box or something, or is there interpretation in there?
Yeah, so I think it would be a stretch. Now, before I go on, what I do want to say is, you know, we have these consultations planned for this year and next year, and that's the exact type of content in the consultation. But for the purpose of today and giving you a clear answer, it's around products designed or intended for use in play by children under 14. And I think the overwhelming majority of the products that we see from sort of an FPV and also sort of a drone domain, they weren't designed or intended for sort of exclusive use in play by children under 14. They're for adults, aren't they, I think? It's kind of a little bit, I suppose, like the YouTube have over the last couple of years recently gone through this whole sort of YouTube kids versus YouTube adult type of definition for their own legal reasons in the States. And they very much have the same kind of thing, that actually they don't mean something that could be viewed by children. They mean something that is specifically aimed at children. And that's what we're looking at here. So we're looking at the cheap Amazon drones that you probably wouldn't fly outside because a light breeze is going to take them away, that have the kids playing with them in the picture and that type of thing, etc. Yeah. And this is completely outside the scope of my expertise because it doesn't involve aviation. I'm pretty sure there's additional sort of regulation and checks in place when you do design a toy for an audience under 14 years of age.
Yes.
And that creates a bigger burden on whoever's manufacturing that product. So,
okay.
I'd be surprised to find a drone or an FPV thing that has been designed to those standards for somebody under 14 specifically.
Yes. So at the moment in aviation terms in the UK, we're in a situation where even the starter kits, because it is something which is flying in the airspace, etc., you still need to have the spotter, you still need to have all of the other rules in place, etc., all of the other follow all of the other regulations and the drone code. But that is something, again, that we would certainly ask the FPV community to step forward during the public consultations and say, hey, do we actually need a line a line drawn somewhere in the sand here that could be done through regulation so that it's a formal thing, basically. So we're right that in our fear that the tiny whoops and things like that, etc., do require the spotter, even though they are sometimes 50 grams, etc., that type of thing.
If you're operating in the open category,
yes.
And I think it's probably, I envision a question on this, so I won't go into too much detail, but that's specific to the open category. So we know you can't fly FPV in the open category without an observer to meet that sort of BLOS definition. There is provisions that exist today that many hundreds, if not thousands, of FPV flyers make use of, like Article 16 authorizations, and FPV UK is an example of that, where you can fly FPV without a competent observer if you're operating in a sterile area. So there are provisions this isn't a blanket, you can't fly anywhere under any category in the UK FPV without an observer. You can, but it's not just in the open category currently. It
is one of those topics that, as I say, always gets sort of, it's one of the fringe areas that gets sort of picked on in terms of, it almost makes the regulations feel absurd. But of course, without drawing lines in it and without those things happening, it's very difficult to have those lines there. So that this consultation, hopefully, again, without making promises that everything we ask for we'll get. Hey, could we have chocolate Easter bunnies delivered every Easter, please, to every registered drone flyer? But yes, it is certainly something that's worth having a conversation on. And as you'll hear me stress on this channel over the next couple of years, we need to engage with these consultations because it's the way to get the voices heard. And perhaps things that many people might, and I'm speaking for myself entirely here, not Canon, but that many people might feel is reasonable, such as tiny whoops not having to have an observer and that type of thing, then actually we might be able to get those through reasonable discussion, through the correct way of engaging, which is obviously the consultation. Up next, and a BV loss question, essentially. Now this is talking about an FPV flyer flying with an observer in an open area, but there's perhaps one or two raised flags in the field, and this question has been raised apparently in the community from the point of view of they feel that if they follow the regulation to the letter, they can't actually necessarily fly through those gates and flags and things because there's going to be no constant line of sight. Because of course, as they go through the flags and out behind, etc., some of them are fairly intricate, some of them are the sort of box ones, etc., that type of thing. So although the observer and the pilot can see the area around it is perfectly safe, so where it's going into and out of, etc. But does that classify itself as a BV loss flight outside of regulation, or what? Yeah.
Sure. Just to clarify my own sort of thinking before I give a response, we're talking about this kind of the flags that kind of have a curve on the top and then go down. They're quite thin, those type of things.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and the similarly designed gates and things, and very much the things that if we watch the British national quad racing, etc., very much those kind of gates and flags, etc., that you see, rather than 30-meter tunnels or anything of that nature. Yeah, certainly.
So from a flag perspective, I think that's absolutely reasonable. And I think there's sort of scope within that legislation that sort of accounts for that. The guidance material is guidance to the law. What we're really talking about here isn't an interrupted sort of view. It's a sort of microsecond, and how fast some of you lot go, it is really a microsecond. Yes. And you already understand and appreciate and can anticipate as you sort of enter that very, very temporary kind of block in VLOS, exactly what that aircraft's going to be doing and where it's going to be pointing when it comes out of that very temporary block of VLOS. So, a degree of kind of sort of common sense, and I'm talking from a regulatory point of view here, not from a community point of view. I know you have common sense, but from a regulator point of view, a degree of common sense applies to that my personal view is I think that's absolutely okay with the type of flags that you're talking about. It is a very, very temporary, minuscule, probably less than it took you to blink, right?
Exactly, and that's it. And that's exactly what Carl is saying when he raised this question, actually. And he is also caveating himself in that same paragraph that both the observer and the pilot can clearly see the area is safe. So, i.e., the pilot through his goggles can see through that and around that flag, and of course the observer can see the either side of it. So, which sounds like we're getting too minutiae in terms of what BV loss is, but it is a fairly common question that I hear in terms of FPV racing, etc. So it's a good one to clarify on, basically. And I think it hopefully moves towards the sort of step that there isn't a feeling to just sort of straight outright ban FPV or something, that it's
So this is a really interesting conversation. First of all, I think it's really important as the regulator for us to answer those questions when they come. What I don't want to happen off the back of that is to create ever more complex regulation for that sort of clarity. So we don't need to make the regulation more complex or the acceptable compliance and guidance, but they're more complex for that specific activity. For things like this, because I think we've just answered that one, haven't we? So it doesn't require that extra paragraph in the AMC and GS.
Because there is always, and again, as I've come back to people that sort of worry about the police / CAA waiting in bushes, I'm not aware of anybody that's even been questioned or investigated, let alone prosecuted for flying a drone BB loss within any kind of FPV race in the UK, etc. So there is that step between the interpretation of regulation and enforcement, of course, which I think is an important one. And as you've said many times on interviews this and last year, because it is now 2023, it is that application of common sense, basically, which is the important part of it.
That there is no driver whatsoever from either the police, who clearly we work with very closely. I've got some very good relationships with members of the police, or anybody within the CAA, to go out and attempt to sort of catch and prosecute people that are, flying within the sort of scope of the law and enjoying the hobby and sort of having fun in the hobby. First of all, there isn't the scope to do that, I don't think, within the police, to be concentrating on all of that. And there's no want to do that. And that's probably why you're not seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of prosecutions for these, for things like that temporary loss of loss as you go behind the flag. It's just not a thing as in the UK.
And actually, the fact that question's come up from the community, to me, shows what a safe community it is. That they're breaking it down to that level and saying, actually, where is the line? Is this okay? Okay, so next we'll move on to the wonderful world of visual observers, or spotters, as many people within the audience would certainly call it. It's obviously one of those subject matters which creates the most, and as I was saying at the beginning of this interview, creates the most issue within the FPV community in terms of whether or not it's required and whether or not it should be required, etc. Is there any scope, come consultation time and that type of thing, and is there any sort of conversations that can be had around that, or is the requirements, the safety requirements, etc., for a visual observer, is that something which is really one of the fundamentals?
I think there's certainly opportunity for perhaps the CAA to learn a bit more about this community and how they operate under the current legislative framework. So I think that's a fair statement to make. We're not going into this with the assumption that we know everything. That's clearly not the case. I think there probably is an opportunity, especially with FPV flyers, because you are a unique community in terms of your level of skill, particularly. As I say, there's always two drone things that impress me now. The firework displays and FPV flyers.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there is probably an opportunity there to revisit some of that,
because it's one of those situations where I have some sympathy for, and some of the time I feel, okay, yes, in a field where there's no one around, I feel like it might be feasible and possible to have something like shielded operations where you don't fly above the trees, and it is very much A3. Very much A3, so there's no buildings around, no people, there are no public footpaths across, etc., that type of thing, that actually perhaps a spotter wouldn't be required in that particular scenario. And I can see some sense to it. There's always what if a dog runs across, or someone hops a fence, or someone else comes to fly their drone in that field and walks across and gets hit by a drone, etc. But again, obviously that isn't happening already with the amount of flights that are happening without spotters. And But then obviously in situations where there are people around, or in A2 category, or even A1, etc., then obviously you have a situation where, of course, I think most people would feel a spotter is required when there are people around, etc., and certainly in commercial operations and that type of thing. So I wonder if there is that kind of appetite, I suppose, in terms of having that conversation, and whether or not that appetite and conversation is actually around the policy team, the people who make these decisions, the people who actually write the final policy, actually having experience of FPV and knowing enough about FPV, which is one of the things, obviously, we have people throw at this topic an awful lot, which is how many drones, full stop, how many FPV drones these people fly. So yeah, it's an interesting topic.
There's a lot to unpack there. The first one, does this raise the question that as part of this kind of exploratory 24-month period, as we sort of go up towards 2026, if perhaps we get out of the office and spend some time with sort of members of the community in the locations in which they operate, and learn a bit more from them beyond just that consultation. I think that's probably a good idea. I'm not putting goggles on because I'm not getting caught on video growing up. So
we'll perhaps have a monitor for you so you can watch on the
yeah. Perfect. And I think it's also important to remember the observers have two things. It's not just around maintaining the visual orientation of the aircraft in relation to not just the ground, but also the air. So clearly you're making that assessment of the ground risk as a visual observer. Has somebody jumped the fence, is some kid running over or whatever it might be. But you're also providing that sort of airspace picture as well. So, if you are operating next to perhaps a ploughed field, do you see or hear that a manned aircraft GA coming in for a landing before the FPV pilot does? And you notify them of that. So that they're there for two reasons, not just the ground element. What I'll also say is everything that, anything you could possibly wish for, you can ask. There's a mechanism to ask. The open category is relatively rigid because of the way it's set up and the way it's set up to be, and kind of the operators it's there to support. But there is nothing preventing an individual applying for an operational authorization, saying, hey, I've got this field that I own or I have some degree of control over, so I know nobody's going to enter it. It's got conifers on every side, 30 feet tall. It's not in any controlled airspace. It's not a low-level flying military area or whatever it might be. You've done this assessment of this location, and then you put a safety case to the CAA saying, can I fly without an observer here? That will absolutely be assessed.
Okay.
And then if it's deemed safe, you will be granted operational authorization to do that.
Yes, to your average hobbyist, that's probably an extremely expensive thing to go through, which is why, of course, yeah, exactly. And FPV UK BMFA, the Article 16, that is an operational authorization, and that is what they have raised through their funds and that type of thing. Indeed. I wonder if that's more theoretical than practical in terms of getting more people flying in the way that they would like to. But I do appreciate that as well, that people are able to do that, certainly.
Yeah. Look, I get it. It's a very complex process or tend to be a complex process if you haven't done it before. For people to go through, and if you're kind of sole recreational user, you're very unlikely to go through that process. But all that process does is provide a mechanism for the CAA to assess not just the operation, but the pilot's competence in terms of skill level and the procedures that the pilot or the operator has in place if either something's go wrong or your pre-flight procedures, your post-flight procedures. It's just a way for the CAA, all an operational authorization is, and submitting a safety case, is a robust mechanism for the CAA to assess that organization and say, actually, you do possess a high level of competency, or you are operating in a location that does have intrinsically a higher degree of safety associated with it. And that's a really important thing for the CAA to do before we sort of afford greater sort of permissions.
Okay, yes. No,
there might be an opportunity to do something similar like that as part of the consultation in the open category.
Yes.
It's just very challenging to look at kind of unique one-off situation for a category that's meant to be a kind of a catch mode.
Okay, could we therefore have a situation where you have the Geeksvana operational authorization for FPV, where we club together as a community and actually put an OA in, and then I presume it's OA and then OSC.
So you submit a safety case. So you submit a safety case, a 3-volume safety case, covering what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, how you can demonstrate that level of sort of competence and all of that good stuff. It feels to me more like for your specific channel, you can really go down the lines with Article 16. Yeah.
Although I would have to look into the liability side of things very heavily, because
and that's the challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Which is where all these things, which I suppose is where you then throw it back at the regulator and say, actually, in practical terms, we need something. And as you say, if there can be, commonality. So if i.e. we are finding that the FPV audience in the consultations are saying the same thing, we need this. We need this and this, and then we can enjoy our hobby a lot more, and we're still safe, etc. Then it's something which can be looked into by the regulator, as opposed to just one guy flying in a field. So that's where the voice needs to come together on these consultations, and you need to genuinely engage as much as possible, put as much information across, because what you're saying may well be the same case for thousands of other pilots in the UK. and then that becomes a commonality that you can regulate for, essentially, so that you can say, actually, it's happening already, it's safe. Let's allow it within the open category, etc. So that's where the engagement is so key, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if there's enough people that have engaged and communicated this challenge that they're having to us, then I'm thinking of this off the top of my head, so I know you will, but don't quote me here. I'll keep doing it. Is there a provision there, given the size of the market in the UK, of some form of FPV competency assessment like the A2 in the open category? So something like the competency assessment we have the open category currently, which is the A2. Is there an FPV competency assessment, and is there a big enough market for that type of assessment that the private sector would have those courses and want to deliver those courses? I don't know. This is canon thinking.
Yes, no, indeed. But yeah, it's an interesting one, because when I first had my UAV hub A2 CFC, why I did the A2 CFC exams up now now probably over 2 years ago, which is shocking, but there we go. And I ran through that. A common comment on those videos was actually from FPV people saying, how does this fit within FPV, and is there one for FPV, etc. So I think there would certainly be that option. And if there was the ability to take a competency test and exam and then therefore unlock certain benefits, I think people would be up for that, especially as you bear in mind a lot of these people within BMFA clubs and that type of thing are already taking tests and are already passing things and holding certificates and that type of thing. So competency, of course, isn't anything alien to the FPV community, and I think that could be a good possibility. But again, all of this, and I sound like a consultation advertisement, but all of this does come back to ensuring, and I'm only stressing this because I really want to see all of these thousands of comments that we've had on these interviews, and all of these, all of the commonality, all of that voice. I want to see that expressed towards these consultations, so that the CAA can take it away and do something with that, basically, and then we can hold you guys to account from the point of view that we can say, look, we have given you all of this information, we have given you this voice in a formal way, in a way that you can actually process it, and hold you to account that way, basically, which I think would be a really healthy way of doing it.
I agree.